if you know anything about the history of ideas, it's not plausible to posit that stories about the nature of reality that existed before 500 years ago were scientific in any but the most cursory of ways. So why we have that argument continually is somewhat beyond me.
So the whole creationist versus evolutionist thing is an example of what he's talking about here. He's starting out by saying how difficult it is to claim that the Bible or books like it, for example, are scientific. I think he has a good point. Not that the Bible doesn't have anything scientific in it, that's not the point, but to claim that the stories written in the Bible about the nature of reality should be scientifically accurate is kind of a strange idea to begin with, because the Bible isn't written like a physics textbook or a technical manual. It's not meant to be read that way. It's not written that way. Like many other ancient books, it's written from an ancient cosmological perspective. So it's focused less on answering the questions that science answers so well, like what is it made of and how does it work, and instead focuses on answering questions like what does it mean and what higher truth does it embody. So less matter, time, space, and energy, and more order and chaos, yin and yang, heaven and earth, symbolically speaking, and especially the higher truths hidden in those concepts. More on that soon.
Part of the reason is, though, that everyone, fundamentalists included, really believe in scientific facts. Even though they hate it, they'll use computers, they'll fly. Computers wouldn't work unless quantum mechanics were correct. It's really hard for people who are trying to hold on to a way of looking at the world that appears to contradict the scientific claims when everything they do is predicated on their acceptance of the validity of the scientific claims. It's really problematic for people.
So again, makes perfect sense. We all believe science works, it's real, and it's amazing. But everybody who believes in the Bible, again, for example, or some other holy book, has a problem on their hands, because today we only view life through the lens of science. And Jordan Peterson is about to show us why that's a problem.
It's problematic in a real way, I think, because one of the problems with the scientific viewpoint is it doesn't tell you anything about what you should do with your life. It doesn't solve the problem of value at all. In fact, it might make it more difficult, because one of the fundamental scientific claims, roughly speaking, is that every fact is of equal utility, at least from a scientific perspective, right?
So it doesn't solve the problem of value at all. Again, science doesn't do much to help us understand morals, meaning, value. It's an amazing tool to answer the questions, how does it work and what is it made of? And it's great for describing the world in terms of matter, space, time, and energy. It's resulted in mind-shattering advances in technology and absolutely catapulted our quality of living to unprecedented levels. So obviously it's a good thing, but, well, it's a good thing in many ways. Can be a bad thing too, of course. But what do we do when we need to understand meaning or morality, higher truth? When our society gets to a point where we desperately need real quality wisdom, where do we turn? This is a difficult problem for people who have limited their vision to a scientific perspective alone, because it matters where you aim. Science helps us aim at technological mastery. It helps us aim at mastering our environment and all sorts of great things, but you can't use it to aim at the highest state of being from a moral standpoint. Love, kindness, peacefulness, so on and so forth. You can't orient yourself toward these things with a scientific outlook alone. It's just not built for it.
There's no hierarchy of facts. It's not exactly true, because you can think of one theory as more true than another, but that boils down to saying that it's more useful than another. So I don't think that that's a really good exception. Okay, so fine. You got the scientific atheists on one end and you got the religious fundamentalists on the other, and what they both agree on, whether they like it or not, is that there's so much power in the scientific method that it's difficult to dispute the validity of scientific facts. And they seem to exist in contradiction to the older archaic stories if you also accept them as fact-based accounts. So what do we do about that? Well, if you're on the scientific atheist end of things, you say, well, those old stories are just superstitious science, second-rate, barbaric, archaic, forms of science, you just dispense with them, they're nothing but trouble. And if you're on the fundamentalist side, you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard. And like, it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but, you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology. So that's a big problem.
Now, the next clip from Peterson is probably the most insightful, but let's deal with this section quickly first. So this is a problem for Christians who believe in science, but also that God created heaven and earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh, for example. After this next clip, I have a very interesting take from Jordan Peterson's friend Jonathan Pageau on why the theory of evolution and the Bible are not at odds at all. And if you're interested in this subject, believe me, it's a must-watch. But anyway, here's Jordan Peterson on the two perspectives he thinks we should have that hopefully can come together and meet in the middle.
So here's another way of thinking about it. You don't just need one way of looking at the world. Maybe you need two ways of looking at the world, and I'm not exactly sure how they should be related to one another, like which should take precedence under which circumstance. But one problem is, what's the world made of? You know, what's the world conceptualized as an objective place made of? And the other is, how should you conduct yourself while you're alive? And there's no reason to assume that those questions can be answered using the same approach. I mean, physics has its methods, and chemistry has its methods, and biology has its methods. So a method for obtaining the truth can be bound to a domain. So why would we necessarily assume that you could use the same set of tools to represent the world as a place of objects and to represent it as a place in which a biological creature would act? I mean, anyways, I'm suggesting that we don't view it that way, that we have two different viewpoints. Maybe they can be brought together, although it's not obvious how, but that it's not a tenable solution to get rid of one in favor of the other. And I think the reason for that is that you need to know how to conduct yourself in the world. You have to have a value system. You can't even look at the damn world without a value system. It's not possible. Your emotional health is dependent on a value system. The way you interact with other people is dependent on a value system. There's no getting away from it. And you say, well, there's no justification for any value system from a scientific perspective. You're going to draw that conclusion that no value system is valid. Where the hell does that leave you? There's no down. There's no up. There's no rationale for moving in any direction. There's not even really any rationale for living. And so people say things like that. Well, why the hell should I care what happens in a million years? Who's going to know the difference? It's like, yeah, true. Stupid, but true. And the reason I think it's stupid is because it's just a game. You know, I can take anything of any sort and find a context in which it's irrelevant. It's just a rational game. It's like, who cares if 100 children freeze to death in a blizzard? What difference is it going to make a billion years? Well, what do you say to someone who says that? You say, well, seems like the wrong frame of reference, bucko. That's what it looks like to me. You know, because at some point you question the damn frame of reference, not what you derive from it. And it certainly seems to me that situations like that don't allow you to use that kind of frame of reference. There's something inhumane about it. And that trumps the logic, or at least it should. And if it doesn't, then all hell breaks loose, and that doesn't seem to be a good thing.
So humanity should trump logic. That's an almost surprising thing to hear, and quite a thing to say in a post-Enlightenment world where rationalism rules. But again, he's not wrong. Humaneness, benevolence should be our top priority, even over logic. And when benevolence, general goodness, morality is put in the back seat, society crumbles. It's precisely what toppled Rome and many other great civilizations. Government corruption, political instability, and weak leadership, military and otherwise, due to lack of morality, leads to collapse. And this is where Pirsig comes in with his metaphysics of quality, which is a theory of reality introduced in his book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I'm not going to go into any details on that here, but I highly recommend this book because he does an incredible job of uniting the classical understanding of reality with the romantic understanding and bridging the gap between Western and Eastern philosophy. Anyway, I said I'd give you a clip from Jonathan Pageau on why evolutionists and Christians shouldn't disagree on the theory of evolution. He echoes here a good bit of what Peterson's saying, but takes it a step or two further, explaining how the Enlightenment did away with things like religion and higher meaning, but now scientists like Vervaeke are turning back to these things with the study of consciousness, for example.
Do you go along broadly Petersonian lines, I guess, or just...
I don't mind Jordan's the way that he describes things. I definitely don't care very much. It's funny because I remember when I was evangelical, people would, they would always want to know if you're a creationist, you're a creationist. And, when I was a teenager, I actually was a creationist for a little while just because everybody around me was a creationist. And then when I started to understand evolutionary theory and started to understand those ideas, I thought, well, these aren't silly. Like there's some interesting things in there. And then I started to pay attention and found it interesting. And then when I mostly discovered a non-scientific vision of the world, a symbolic vision of the world, then it started not to matter to me. And so people would ask me, do you believe in evolution? And my answer is always, I don't believe in evolution. I think it happened, but I don't believe in it. Like I don't think about it. I don't trust it. I don't put my trust in evolution. It doesn't bother me that things mechanically happen that way, but it doesn't seem to me like that's the best structure to know how we should live today and how we should be together and how we should live in community. I think the phenomenological approach to the way we experience the world, to phenomena, I think is far more useful in order to describe how we actually exist in the world. And I also think that the religious structures and the religious symbolic structures are far more useful to help us understand the purpose of existence. And so because of that, until today, I usually don't. And then so when I heard Jordan talk about evolution the way he talked about it, I thought it was interesting because I thought, oh, it's interesting because he's able to talk about it in a manner which takes into, okay, so this is a way, I think I've mentioned this before in one of the Q&As, is that the interesting thing that's happening, and which I do find interesting, is that as, let's say, science has taken over the entire field of perception, let's say, in the new atheist types, where it's like science is everything, scientific knowledge is everything. And then we even have, now like this whole science of consciousness and all of that. And that's what Jordan uses often to describe some of the things he's describing. Then what happens is they can no longer pretend like they're in absolute opposition to religious thinking. Because, the whole Enlightenment was done in opposition, was done in like, we're going to get rid of this dark, horrible thing that's religion, and we're going to replace it with reason and with science and with all this. And so that kind of march of progress and that march of thinking, now it's over. It's like, okay, so now you can't, you've taken over the entire field. And so now you actually now have to explain religion. It has to fit in your model, or else if it doesn't fit in your model, there's something missing. There's something missing in your model. You've opposed it to put your model in front, but now you have to include that which you fought if you want your model to be all encompassing. And in doing that, that's where we're seeing this strange flip, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, things are now flipping back, where we're realizing the supremacy of consciousness and the inevitability of hierarchies of meaning. All these things are now appearing even in the eyes of the scientists. John Vervaeke is, of course, a perfect example of that. And so it's an interest to me that I find very interesting. And so that's one of the reasons why I pay attention to this to this whole thing that's going on with Jordan and with John Vervaeke and with other, and the discussion with other people who are talking, and what's the name of the other guy there, the consciousness guy, forget his name again. We talked about him quite so many times. What's his name?
Oh, right, Hoffman.
Yes,
Donald Hoffman.
Don Hoffman. There you go, that guy. So anyway, so that's what I find. That's definitely something that I find very interesting, and I think it's really that which has made me all of a sudden pay attention to science more, because you know, because I think that there's an interesting thing happening right now, and it's worth paying attention to, and it's worth speaking into it. And I think that if you notice the way that I speak, I think that I've adjusted the way that I speak to people, and I've adjusted the way that I give my talks. Some, not always, but sometimes I've adjusted them to talk to those people, to talk to the people who are kind of realizing this shift that's going on right now, and this flip. And so to be able to speak into it in a manner that they'll understand. All those talks that I did, you know, like sacred art in secular terms and sacred space in secular terms, is pretty much addressed to those people who are suddenly realizing that you no longer can avoid hierarchies of meaning, and you can't avoid, you know, consciousness as at least the question to be answered, you know, to be talked to be discussed, you know. So I think that's an interesting aspect of science that I care about, let's say.
Mhm.
So that's the only reason why I could care about evolution.